This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
It's hard fitting it all into 20 minutes. Our next speaker is Dr. Janice Wilton, who I have heard a lot about, but only just met today. Dr. Janice Wilton is well known in oral history circles and has been associated with both the International and the National Oral History Association for some time. She's also written extensively on migration history in Australia. So today she's talking on Edna and Josh, Worlds Apart, Words to Remember, and this particular talk has a very personal nature for Janice.
And this is a presentation that's about family history, and it's my family history, which indeed is always a confronting thing to do. I think it's a sign of age. You know, you get to my stage and say, what's the thing I haven't done? I've spent my life looking at other people's family stories and immigration histories, and there's something in my own family that I want to look at. And so I'm looking at immigration in my own family history. But I'm also, it's an issue, the other framing aspect of this presentation is that it's about revisiting interviews with a different purpose. The thing that Joanna Bornat talks about as a second take, when you record a set of interviews for one purpose, but you go back to them for a different purpose. So let me just frame it with a couple of slides, and then I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. This is sort of, I'm just starting on doing this because I used the conference as the trigger to make me do this, which is something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I started a bit last year, and now I'm starting to do it. So that's sort of the formative stuff in here. But let me start off. And this, you only have to notice the colours. I'm not expecting you to read it, okay? But can you see colours? Can you see different colours? So this is my version of my generation. I think it's great. We've had generations at this conference, but my generational approach is quite different. Now, if I wander over there, will you hear me? If I go over here, can you still hear me? Or do I need to actually... Can you hear me up the back? Because I feel like sort of jumping up and down in front of the screen, doing something. So I've got to explain my little chart. This is my husband and myself, okay? Can you work out the rest? There are our parents, our grandparents, our I stopped there, great-grandparents and going back. The coloured boxes are telling you where members in our family were born. So we have migration in our family as a part of our family history. Going back from the most recent, indeed, is my husband and his parents, who came out in the post-war period to Australia. So I'm looking only at immigration into Australia. Some of their stories go way back. But the colour boxes tell you that in our family history, we have, my husband born in what was then Palestine. He has a Palestinian police report notes. How about a birth certificate? I think he'd rather a birth certificate. But grew up in Israel. His parents came from Poland via Israel to Australia. They came out. Then my paternal grandparents, English. In fact, my father, if he'd been born 10 weeks earlier, would have been born in England. And then my mum's family goes back with a predominance, as you can see, German background. So that's a framing. And what I'm interested in doing, I actually have the fortune to have interviews with everyone in this generation. And all but my mother-in-law are no longer with us. But there are interviews of varying qualities and for different purposes. Whoops, that's the wrong microphone. I'm talking into the light. Will the light work? Okay, so I've got interviews with them. And I thought, when I was doing this, I want to see, as an oral historian, what happens if you do a sort of family history that starts with a bunch of interviews from a particular generation. So it's that generation. And obviously it's doing different things, because I've got one bunch who are first generation arrival immigrants. And then with my mum, it goes all the way back. So I'm talking about oral traditions. So I'm going back and I'm asking, looking at what I get out of those interviews about immigration, about ethnic identity, about all those things. And my other framing references, okay, you all watchers of Rena won't be, but Gruen Nation. How many you all know Gruen Nation? And you'll notice one of the really good things about Gruen Nation is Todd Sampson's T-shirts. Okay, so Todd Sampson's T-shirt is another framing reference for me for what I'm doing. You can't see, I had to snap them off iView, but the image, do I need to translate the image? Here we have asylum seeker boat, here we have sailing boat, convict ship, whatever, 19th century. here we have a little thing saying them equals us. And it's making very graphically, very simply that statement that with the exception of the Indigenous people who are dispossessed by the arrival of the rest of us, we're all immigrants. You know, that's a trite. I always used to think it was a trite statement, but I thought here it's a very powerful political statement. And I personally am distressed and horrified at the inhumanity that this country is demonstrating towards refugees, towards asylum seekers. So it's sort of in that frame that I'm actually even, and that's why I'm revisiting interviews. These interviews were done for quite a different purpose, with actually a political thing behind it. And that's sort of there as a German. I needed to raise that because as I was putting this together, saying, what am I going to do with these interviews I want to handle with my mum and my father-in-law, and this is one of the framing elements in it, is that concern for us to acknowledge that all along the way we all have aspects of that experience and that we should be, humanity is what I think we need, humane treatment. So, okay, so that's my big, broad framing thing. Really academically conceptual, as you can see, but big, broad framing element to it. And what I want to do is just give two, hopefully not too long examples, one with my mum and one with my father-in-law, of the sort of thing I'm doing and playing with this idea of what happens when I use oral history interviews to understand something about immigration in my own family, so I'm understanding my own family history, but I'm also looking at things that are much wider than that. The sort of things I've spent my whole professional life doing, which is pulling apart other people's lives. And it's really confronting when you do it to your own family, because indeed, you know, here I've got my, I think Anne-Marie's thing about sensory things. You know, this is my mum sitting on my shoulder. She made my bowl of mice. And so I carry my mum with me, very sort of, you know, physically on my shoulder. So I'm very aware of it. So here I go. This is my mum. This is a photo of my mum. She passed away in 2009. It's amazing to have her voice. Okay, so it's an image of my mum. Then I should do this thing. This is her paternal grandparents, Odoins. Odoins born in, they came out with their parents as children, they were children, came out from Germany and came to South Australia. They're Barossa Valley Germans who then moved in the 1860s, 1870s up to the Riverina in New South Wales. Okay, so that's the paternal grandparents, mums. And these are her maternal grandparents. The guy in the uniform, George Griffith, he's in a Red Cross uniform. He was born in Birmingham. He died in Birmingham because he went back to work for the Red Cross, and I'll be coming back to him. He was a very devout Baptist. And his wife, Emma Miller, her family name is really Muller, German and English ancestry. Okay, so that's the background we're looking at. With Mum, so Mum, it's not about her immigration experience. Oh, I forgot. This is her map. This is my mum's mud map, which I'll contextualise also in a minute because she's giving her own name, of the Riverina area in which she grew up, which was a German-Australian settlement in the Riverina, for those of you who don't know, just above the Queensland border, around Albury. Okay, so this is where she grew up, the place called Walla Walla, originally called Ebenezer, after the South Australian town. They thought, oh, okay, we can't have Ebenezer here, we'll do it Walla Walla. And that's the community in which she grew up. So the two things I'm interested in about Mum, in looking at, and I'm listening for different things. You know that deep listening thing when you go back to an interview and you're asking different questions of it? So I've been listening to what she's saying in two things, and what I'm going to tell you about now is her oral traditions about the German history in her family, and also then her experiences of growing up in what was still a German-Australian community. And I've got to do this all very briefly, and you've got to watch me for time, and I'm trying not to digress, I promise, because things, you know how things pop into your head, you say, I've got to tell you this amazing thing, but I won't. I'm trying to be really controlled. That's a bit silly, I can't do that. So she says quite openly in the interviews, my father's family was German. So my father's family was German, not a problem. I want you to start looking at the language Mum uses. And one of the repeated stories, I did a couple of interviews with her. I could do a whole discourse on the nature of those interviews, but I won't. That's another story. And there are a couple of repeated stories. I just want to play you one of them, which will get a sense of the sort of story she tells about her family's German background. And it links straight to some of the stuff you're talking about, Christy. I think most of this does anyway. And Hillendale, the place she refers to, is the family farm in which she grew up. So let's see if this works. This is my mum. And I hear
I know at Hillendale there were quite a lot of German books. And there were supposed to be other things down. There was a cellar under the Hillendale dining room, but we never ever got down into that. We didn't ever get down. We were always a bit curious. No, I know there were quite a few German books. I gather they were grandfather's, because Dad spoke very little German. And they all had to be hidden. But I know they hid a lot of the books during the First War, because a lot of people were then interned during the war. Our next door neighbour was interned with that's what killed him. He had 2 sons in the army, 2 sons of the Australian Army.
So she has the tradition, the stories being passed down of what happened to members of the community. She was born in 1919, so it's an oral tradition that's passed down. And if you listen carefully, you can hear my children crying in the background in these interviews. They were done when the kids were small, and factor that into doing these interviews. That's interesting. So this is her sense of saying, you know, there's this German part to my history, my family, but it's always talking about, and this is the thing that really struck me as I was listening again to the interviews and looking for the indicators about what being German meant. And so I've just pulled out, this is, you know, when you extract things totally out of context, but I thought these phrases are important. Look at the language. When she talks about the neighbouring families, they were good German folk, okay? When she talks about, she says it was one of the biggest Lutheran churches in Australia, I think, in Walla Walla. You possibly know about the Walla Walla Lutheran Church. And she talks about the 2 different churches of there, the 2 different Lutheran branches. It was a German settlement. She starts associating Lutheranism with German with being Lutheran. They used to have German services. So it's the other people in the community. We didn't belong to the actual German community, the Lutheran church at Walla. She says this, and what she's saying, indeed, is, and it's captured in this next quote, her father, William Odwin, was brought up in the Lutheran church. They were Lutheran, but the bloke you saw in the uniform, George Griffith, was a Baptist from the nonconformist tradition in Birmingham, so a set of beliefs and values brought again from somewhere overseas, and one of his requirements on mum's parents marrying was that you bring up the children in the Baptist church. So my mum and all her family and even her father became Baptists, okay? And they distanced themselves. And so she's talking all the time about the German community being equated with the Lutherans in Walla. And because she was a Baptist, she was distancing herself from that being German. So that's one of the things that was happening here. And the other thing, when I asked about the community more broadly, this captured one of her summing statements about it. We talked about, you know, in the Second World War, she remembered one of the pastors momentarily being interned, to Pastor Stoltz, I think his name was. She talked about some people still speaking German, the kid that went to school and could still only speak German because that's what they were speaking at school. But then her statement is, oh, you know, but by the Second World War, they were pretty well entrenched Australians, though German was still being spoken. So she's actually starting to identify. It's almost contrary to what you're saying for her in that sense. She's saying they're becoming Australians. And this is really Mum's view, because the other way I can document it, apart from in the interview, is one of the crazy things. We do quite a few crazy things in our family. But one of them is that Mum, not only did she make mice, she also, I'm sorry, I should have got a photo of one of her creations. These are her animals that she created called wallabundries. You know the wombles of Wimbledon. Well, she saw a womble and then she decided she'd make her Australian version of wombles. And in fact, and then we put it, she did drawings of them, but she also created them out of found materials. So I have these amazing collection of creatures called wombles, and she has stories attached to them. And they're all stories. You know, there's one about my husband called Tom the taxi driver, because my husband was a taxi driver for a long time, and he also, his whole life has been a pill popper. So she gave him a bag of pills to carry with him in his taxi. It just sort of, but anyway. So this is, and these reflect a lot of them. The stories she wrote for kids are stories about growing up in the Riverina, and her story starts, and it's in her language. You know, it says wallabundries, that's what she called them, walla walla, walbundry, wallabundries. Maybe a mixture of many cultures in appearance, in behaviour, even in action, but in spite of everything, down under. They really belong down under, and are now Dinkum Aussies. That I do know. So her sort of story, by me pulling these bits out, is a thing that says, yeah, we have a German background, but there's something called a Dinka Mozzie. And so if I'm stepping back from that, I guess I say, because I've added this element to what I'm saying, is that English Baptist heritage and altered her connection to her Germanness, and indeed the notion of assimilation, that wasn't just a rhetoric for her, it was something that she imbibed in the way she lived. And I think by the time, I don't know if I want to say it, I think she also developed a sense that there were Dinka Mozzies and then there were others. And the others would possibly be more recent arrivals, okay? That sort of rhetoric became part of who she was and the way she thought. She was a wonderful woman, don't get me wrong. My mum was fantastic. But it's that, when you listen closely. So that's one of the ways I'm going. I've still got time. I want to do Josh. Let me introduce you to Josh. This is going, so worlds apart. So she's growing up in the Riverina in a German-Australian community from 1919. Josh, my father-in-law, Joshua Eisenberg, who has also passed away in 2011. They were long livers, born in Austria, part of Austria that was to become Poland. So grew up in Poland in 1933, migrated to what was then Palestine. In 1955 came to Australia with his wife and 2 children, one of those children being my husband. So here's a story of multiple migrations. I just wanted to focus as an example on his emigration from Poland. He's Jewish, right? So the immediate narrative is a narrative about anti-Semitism where he says things, and throughout his life, and I got to know Josh really well, he's very anti-Polish. I haven't any pleasant memories of Poles. I love this. If anything, this is a documented statement. I have really bias against Poland. He also, in there are other elements, because he's talking about how he is an aggressive boy. He was actually played soccer with and how he didn't look, as he described, as a typical Jewish boy, and that meant at times, he has a graphic story where he remembers being a group of young people coming to beat them up, but because he didn't look Jewish, he was put to one side and his mate was beaten up and he felt powerless because he was outnumbered. So he has stories like that. So you've got anti-Semitism as one of the threads. It's Poland, it's 1930s Poland. It hasn't got as graphic as it does later in the 1930s, but that's one element. But there's another element. There's an organisation, now my Hebrew, you talk about your German, you should try me with Hebrew, the Hashomer Chatzayer, like it's a type of Boy Scout Girl Guide movement, Zionist. So training young Jews that there's another life, you can go to Palestine, create a life, and we teach you how to live off the air, to become producers of the land. And so he was involved with that, and so got a sense of there's another life somewhere else in Palestine. So okay, so now we've got anti-Semitism in Palestine. That's okay, he's young, he's adventurous, but it's much more complicated like that. It's Christy, it's your thing about, it's so, am I talking too fast now because I want to get to the end? Oh, okay, so this is, and there in the Hakshara came the disaster, he says. And this disaster is about his older sister Malka, who is the young woman on your left, Malka, and I'll let him tell the story.
So my sister Malka went to such a thing a year before matriculation, and my parents were heartbroken that here a gifted girl that had such, they thought, had such a future before her, leaves high school and goes to Hakshara. And there in the Hakshara came the disaster. She found a man that was a communist, dragged her out from the Zionist movement. She became a communist, and then she became pregnant, and then in 32, a year before I went to matriculation, my parents were informed that she's in prison in the town Lublin, which was more to the east, far away from us. And I remember walking with my mother in the street to a solicitor, to hire a solicitor for her so far away. And we were very, we were not poor, but we were very hard up because this was in the middle of the world crisis, and we were supported by the grandparents. So that is the first thing now. And then hush came the information that she's also pregnant. Well, then I left for Palestine. I never saw it.
So it's a complex reason for leaving Poland, and it's his uncle Wolf pays for him. There's also the element of wanting to go to university, a bit more difficult in Poland, but his uncle was willing to pay for it. And when he decided to go to Palestine, his uncle paid for him to go to Palestine. And this is Josh in the photograph in the back just before he left for Palestine. The person missing from the family photograph is Malka, because she is in prison. He doesn't see Malka again. He also doesn't see anyone except his brother, because his brother also got out to Palestine. The others all disappeared for various reasons during the Holocaust. So looking back, when he looks back at his experiences, of course, the whole issues about anti-Semitism are heightened because he's looking back through the Holocaust and what happened to his family and indeed to his wife's family, because she's the only surviving member of an entire extended family because he got her out to Palestine. And it's also, and I probably won't have time to play the next excerpt, but the next excerpt is how he talks about that it was his trend to the left, so he left. His parents were happy that he should go. He gets to Palestine, and in Palestine he discovers what it is no longer to be able to sit at home, to be able to go on hikes, do the rest of it. He has to make a living. But in fact, the narrative that comes out of this initial stories about immigration have themes in it that go right through his interview, themes about, well, anti-Semitism, about his own physical prowess. Playing soccer is, in the end, in a nutshell, how he gets his childhood sweetheart out from Poland. And his dislike of extremism, whether it's communism, orthodox, any sort of extremism. So all those threads are in the story he tells about immigration. And if I just finish with my, so they're the sort of things that I've talked about. And that Palestine is really, in the three places he lives, Palestine is the place that he's happiest, that he has the formative memories, the strongest memories, the clearest memories. And that's a really interesting thought. It's not Australia and it's not Poland. It's very clearly Palestine/Israel. So I've added an element to all of this. So this is a photograph. It's my son. This is about the time I did the interview. There's also a little girl. So you have to imagine I'm doing these interviews with these kids around. And so that's my mum and Josh with their grandson. At the time, for both of them, what we said was, let's record these stories for your grandchildren. You are not their grandchildren, okay? You are definitely not their grandchildren. They told their stories. And what I'm doing now is stepping back from that and saying, I want to do it still for the family, because that's really important, and how amazing it is that we have their voices. But I also think there's a great deal more in these interviews that can be used as a way of talking about the nature of immigration, the impact of immigration, the oral traditions, the way to read oral traditions across generations, a whole thing about an impact of assimilation when you grow up in an environment in which that is the rhetoric, and so a whole range of things like that. And that raises ethical issues about, should I be doing this? I hope, and I always think one of my favourite early articles, and it's always stuck in my head in oral history, is I've gone blank, Borland. What's her first name? Catherine Borland's article about That's Not What I Said, when she sort of communicates with her grandmother about, hey, this is your story, this is my version of it. And she said her only solution was to say, we both have a right to say something, but I just have to be very careful, because it's very confronting when it's your own family. You know, if they were in the audience, what would they be saying to me? You know, so that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.